Greetings, fellow explorers, and welcome to the 12th episode of Geekoscopy101, the podcast that explores the nexus between science, story, wonder, and philosophy with me, your host, Dr. Yanis Kisten, and today we're exploring the depths of marine science and Dungeons and Dragons with marine scientist and DM of Dugongs and Sea Dragons D&D podcast, Professor Joshua Drew. How are you doing, Prof Drew?
Thank you so much for welcoming me. I'm super excited about it. This is a really cool podcast that you have up and running. And, on behalf of the players and the community, we're super stoked to be here. So thank you.
Yes, and I'm super stoked to chat to you. Can't wait to chat to you and the producer and some of the cast. But first, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so I am, not surprisingly, a marine biologist. I am an assistant professor at the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry, or as we like to call ourselves, SUNY ESF, here in Syracuse, New York. And
how did this journey to become a marine biologist come about?
I mean, honestly, I was always a kid who liked being outside. I grew up in Albany, New York, so not near the ocean, but I liked going hiking and being outside. And I remember in undergrad, I took we had a January break, and my school used to run 3-week courses during January. And I went to one in Mexico, and I had the opportunity to do like a Discover Scuba in Isla Mujeres outside of Cancun. And the first time I had gone scuba diving, we did the standard checkout, and the dive master, the other type of DM, was right with us. And I remember I got buzzed by this green sea turtle. It just sort of swam right over my head and into my field of vision. And I was like, wow, you could do this for a living? And so, I think I kind of got into marine science through a love of being outside and natural history. And then, once I started studying it, I realized that there were a lot of very pressing conservation needs that, that seemed like a good use of my time, or at least what 21-year-old Josh thought, and still doing it. So I've been really blessed and lucky to be able to survive the winnowing period of academia and be able to make it so far.
So did you start off with a different major before going to marine science?
We had just sort of a generalized biology major.
Okay.
And I was an anthropology minor, and that actually turned out to be really helpful because, back when I was an undergrad, those were very separate camps. But now that, we're learning more about coupled natural human systems, and we're learning about socio-ecological systems, having that background in anthropology and sort of the critical theory of political ecology and things like that, as a conservation biologist, that's becoming so valuable to have that understanding of how cultures interact with the natural environment. I think, when I was an undergrad, those were quite separate, but I'm glad that I sort of stuck around and have been had that training and been able to apply that now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the socioeconomic factors involved, you can't ignore them. I think we have, as scientists in the past, kind of stuck in our little labs and not conferred with the general populace and stakeholders. And I think that might have been a mistake, or maybe we just didn't realize how important it is to have as many people in the conversation as possible, especially when it comes to conservation and, marine spatial planning and stuff like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct.
Okay, so off from the academics for a bit, how did you get into D&D?
Oh man, I don't even remember. I think it started in maybe 3rd grade when I started reading Dragonlance, those novels that TSR put out back in the day. Yeah. And those were the first novels that really captivated me, and the first sort of adult, or at least, non-young adult novels that I read. And I can remember 4th grade reading Dragons of Winter Night, or whatever the second one was. And I remember distinctly, I just blew through it in a weekend. And that was the first time that I wasn't watching cartoons. I wasn't going out. I totally got like on the couch with a blanket and like some hot cocoa and just powered through that book. And then when I realized there was a system behind that, I was all in. And so me and my buddies played from like 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. And then high school, it was like a little not cool. And then I took like 30 years off. And then I was visiting my buddy, Scott Smith, out in Portland for the 2016 ESA, Ecological Society of America. And I was hanging out with Scotty and he was playing and I was like, oh yeah, I used to love this game. And so we started talking about it and it got me super excited about it. So I went from basically 1st edition to 5th edition, which for those who played 3rd and 4th edition, I wasn't missing much. And then like a lot of people in this D&D renaissance, the accessibility of independent games, like a million other people, with the stuff Matt Mercer's been doing with Critical Role really got me engaged again. And then the opportunity to listen to, sort of feminist centered podcasts like the Broadswords or D20 Dames, ones that moved away from the D&D being a simply here's a monster, we hack at it. Really exploring what you can do with role playing. That 8-year-old Josh liked hacking stuff, but now that I'm an adult, I really enjoy the nuance of seeing the characters solve problems without just poking it with metal bits.
Yeah, I mean the freedom sort of D&D allows for all of these unique ways of approaching things, which what makes the game so cool compared to how stuck you are, I suppose, with video games and what you can encode thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also I have 2 sons, and it was nice to be able to have a thing that we could do together. And so we started playing on Sunday afternoons, I guess 3 years ago now. And so we've had like a pretty serious sort of father-son home game going with other kids in the neighborhood and a couple other, a dad in the area. And just to have something to be able to do with your kids and be able to share and tell stories with them and to give kids a sense of agency. A lot of times if you're a small child, you don't have a whole lot of say in how your life goes. And so giving them an opportunity for them to be the heroes and determine how the adventure turns out, I think is pretty empowering for them. And so as a DM, that's cool because you can be slapsticky and you can be over the top with little kids and they'll totally eat it up. But then as a dad, it's really fun too, to see them, lean into the role playing part and learn how to do that. I'm always telling them to use their words, right? And so this is a great example of doing that.
For sure, yeah. I if and when I have kids one day, I would like to get them into D&D as soon as possible. How early did you start them on it?
I started with my older son when he was 9. And because my younger son is a younger brother, he immediately wanted to start in. But I think we started with him when he was in kindergarten, the end of kindergarten. So 6-ish or so. And, you have to modify the rules a little bit and maybe you keep track of the hit points and stuff. But the storytelling aspect, the sort of the important part, that is easy enough to do. And, kids like the thrill of rolling a natural 20 is not age limited. Like they liked rolling that and shouting around. And I remember early on, we had some game and my younger son rolled a nat 20 with disadvantage. So he rolled 2 natural 20s at a time. And so he was able to do something so cool, big and heroic. Yeah. And I mean, that was like 3 years ago. And we still talk about that time that he rescued the farmers from the kobolds or something like that. So it's a fun aspect of it.
For sure. I mean, some of the memories that you generate like in game almost feel as if they're like real in your head. And I think there is some research that says that the connections are very similar to real, like lived experiences. I haven't read through that just yet, but I'm very interested. And before we continue, you said you were into some feminine D&D podcasts. I'm going to give a shout out to my friends over at Dum Dum Die, the South African all-female, all-awesome podcast. That's what my friend Carlo calls it. Yeah, they do some really cool stuff over there.
And I think that's so important because you go back to when I first started playing in the late 80s, early 90s, and the modules were all hack and slash. The covers were all the chainmail bikini ladies, and it was very heteronormative and very sort of low-key misogynistic. And I'm glad to see that both, they're not perfect, but Wizards of the Coast has tried to improve that. And more so, the community has really taken the sort of the feminist D&D community has really taken hold and found a place for them to tell their own voices. And that's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I envision D&D as a game for everybody. I got into it really late, so I never really, got the whole, I suppose, misogynistic stuff. But I can imagine in the early years, there was definitely a, demographic that was aimed for. But nowadays, it's for everybody. Or that's what I believe.
Absolutely. And we're better off for that.
Indeed. So how specifically did Dugongs and Sea Dragons come about?
Yeah, so we... It started because Travis Nielsen who plays the Porter, and earlier Carl. He is a conference organizer, and I was part of the program. I was a co-chair for the program committee for the International Marine Conservation Congress in 2018, which was in Kuching, Malaysia. And so as part of my duties, we would go through and we would sort, which presentations were coming in. We would see who was going to review which conference talks and basically, come up with a program. And I don't remember if it was Travis or me. One of us made an offhand remark about having to have a hard end on a meeting because we had a D&D game. And then the other one, either myself and then my co-chair, Stephanie Sardellis, she also played, and we all realized that we were big D&D fans, but none of us knew about it. We sort of outed ourselves to it. Yeah. And they were like, well, it's our program. Why don't we build in a D&D game? And so since we could design however we wanted the conference, we blocked off as one of the evening events, we were going to have this live Dungeons and Dragons game. And we had no idea what it was going to be like. But Travis knew that Chris Parsons, who is sort of the heart and soul of Dugongs and Sea Dragons, and edits the vast majority of the episodes. So thank you, Chris. Was a big fan, and so Travis and Chris arranged a bunch of people together. I've always DM'd, and so I volunteered to do that as well. And we had a live recording, maybe about 25 or 30 people showed up. There was a cash bar. We had some, thanks to Kraken Dice, we had some giveaways. So we were able to hand out sets of dice. And it was super fun. It went way better than I thought it was. I thought it was going to be 4 people showing up and we'd all be sort of geekily sitting around. And while we were geekily sitting around, we were raucously geeking sitting around. And that was rad. So we did that live game and they were like, that was so much fun. I want to do it again. And we were all over the place, but, thanks to the internet, that's not really a problem anymore. And so we decided that, most of the people who played originally wanted to keep going. And we spent a little bit of time kind of coming up with a concept, but it was built off of what I made up for the game Zero. And then it's just kind of been going on since then.
So we probably should have done this earlier, but can you give us a premise for the whole show? What is Dugongs and Sea Dragons?
The idea is that at least for campaign 1, the group of heroes called the Cephala Squad is working their way through against some nefarious enemies who have desires to take over the ocean trading. So they live in a coastal town named Aranax, which is named after the scientist in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And they work for the regent of Aranax, Balanoptera, which is the genus that blue whales are in. And they've been kind of going through a series of quests, and they discovered some corruption within the city governance. They've discovered that there was a series of pirate attacks. And they've all had this sort of low-key enemy that has been weaving in and out. And as we record this, we are coming up to the final showdown where the enemy is revealing themselves, and they're going to have to find out ways to deal with that. But one of the things that I really like about it is that, and we may talk about this later on, is that, given who we are all marine scientists playing. There's no way a recording session is going to get made without some sort of nerdy science weaving its way in. And sometimes that's explicit. More often than not, that's just us talking about, what is the physics of shouting underwater? How does that work with your larynx? Or, how would a thermocline impact the way a spell would work underwater? Things like that. And so it's we like to think that the show is both educational as well as entertaining.
Which is where all the magic happens.
Absolutely,
at least in my opinion. So you just talked about integrating kind of scientific principles and theory into the game. So how much of that is kind of intentional? Like, do you plan to do any beforehand, especially with prepping for the sessions and for the campaign?
Yeah, Yannis, early on, we definitely put a lot of thought into it, and that's not to say that it's not educational now. But early on, when we were sort of world building and having the players explore around, there were a lot of opportunities to figure out, to weave science in. So, like, for example, one session, we took a page from the Essex, the famous ship that was attacked by a whale, and we had the ship that the heroes were on was struck and rammed by a whale, and that's not only sort of has a historical precedence, but there's science out there that sort of took a biomechanic approach at it and modeled what the forces of a rogue bull sperm whale would have, and actually showed that it's not that hard for them to go and sink a boat. So we had an opportunity to talk about that. The whole premise of the town is based upon it's a fishing town, and so because it's on the west side of the continent, we have a whole opportunity to talk about the way the currents work with the Coriolis effect and upwelling, and weave that in, and the town of Aranax wouldn't exist without that oceanographic and fisheries feature. So I think when we were world building, we built that in a little bit more. Now, probably the last 20 episodes or so have been moving towards the dramatic conclusion. And, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but we have been focusing a little bit more on the drama at this point in time. There's still obviously a lot of science that's present within it. But I have been focusing a little bit more on, so one of the characters' significant others was kidnapped, and another part, they had to find a map to help them. And so there's a couple different moving pieces. And so I've been trying to make sure I track those. But as I said, organically, it just appears quite often just because of who we are. And so we will have scientists dropping random fish facts in. We had a whole section about where some of the good guys had an aid of a group that was based out of a guano castle. And so we had a whole session talking about guano. And we actually, I really liked this part. We found a book from the late 1800s that described what the guano islands off of Namibia looked like, and right along the Skeleton Coast. And it had this really graphic and very grand sort of Victorian way of describing it. And you don't see that in scientific writing anymore, but you certainly see that in fantasy writing. And so as I was describing the scene, I just, I credited it, but I basically straight up stole 2 or 3 paragraphs from that scientific paper, because it was this sort of grand description of the seals and the guano and the birds swirling around.
That's pretty cool. What other works of, I suppose, fiction do you draw inspiration from?
I've been reading a lot of the Pathfinder tales, which were put out by Paizo, I think you pronounce it. They're the people who produced Pathfinder. I've been reading those novels a lot, and they have come in a fair amount. And then I've also been reading, it's an odd subgenre, but wildlife true crime. So things like The Feather Thief, The Orchid Thief, The Falcon Thief. They do have titles other than noun thief, but but just sort of these tales about wildlife smuggling, and those ideas have found their way in both in obvious and less obvious ways.
When you were talking about Dragonlance earlier, I was just thinking that I also read those books when I was in primary school, but I had no connection or indication that it was connected to D&D in any way. Only like a couple of decades later did I learn about that. It was quite interesting. And I actually didn't even get into D&D through like role playing. I got in through like the board games that came out when 4th edition was around, which is even weirder.
But it doesn't matter how you get here, just as long as you get here.
Yeah. I think that's the main. As long as we're in there, because it's so cool. But talking more about the geeky stuff and geeking game culture, how do you incorporate anything in geek culture in your everyday work, or do you feel like those are two totally separate, or maybe they've blended in?
No, absolutely. I incorporate it, and to the point that my students all know that I'm a dungeon master, and they make D&D jokes in class, which is cool to be able to connect with students that way. But this semester, for instance, I'm teaching a class on population ecology. So, how populations grow and things like that. And we just had our midterm 2 weeks ago. And so for the prep, instead of having a study session, the sort of a Q&A session prior to giving the midterm, where they come in, they ask me, what does R mean, or what is lambda, things like that. I wanted them to not focus on the specifics, but to zoom out and think about how you would use the information that you gain in population ecology, the information that you get in the class, to do conservation and management. And so I did an RPG with them, and I gave them, I said that, you are a group of wildlife biologists, and you have 10 weeks to come up with a management plan, and each one of you have $25,000 to spend. And then I drew a map, and I said, you have to manage a rare orchid, I think because I was reading The Orchid Thief at the time, and a fairly common mucellid, a weasel or something like that. And you have to simultaneously manage these two populations. And I gave them some options. And it was, it was like a choose your own adventure. I said, what do you want to do first? And they said, well, we should probably figure out where the species are. And I was like, yes, that's right. So you could conduct a survey, and that's going to take 1 week, and it's going to cost $15,000. And once they did the survey, they sort of, quote unquote, unlocked some information. And depending on what they did with that, they would unlock other pieces of information that they could weave into the narrative that the conservation narrative that they were coming up with. And kind of circling back a little bit, one of the things that they could do was to do a stakeholder interview. It was $5,000, was relatively inexpensive. But when they did it, I said that they met with the local town's orchid club, and several individuals were really excited to know that this rare orchid species was here. And one individual was very interested in getting very specific information as to where to find the orchid. And of course, at that point in time, they're like, oh no, he's a poacher, right? And so that then later on influenced how they were going to do the management because they chose that one option, they unlocked that there are poachers. And so you have to think about conservation in urban areas a little bit differently if, there's going to be people who are, potentially out going to target those. And so it was this really fun, interactive, it took us about an hour and a half. And they ended up really enjoying thinking about how each one of the topics that they learned. So like productive rate, density dependence, carrying capacity, all these kind of, I don't know if they're dry or not, but they're very independent terms. By zooming out a little bit and incorporating gameplay and role playing, they really got an opportunity to weave them together. And the fact that their choices unlocked information, or that the actions they took gave them new tools, not only is part and parcel of what a good dungeon master does, right? It's like exploring, I almost wanted them to be like roll an insight check when they were talking to the sketchy guy. But it also mimics what science is like. If you have to manage an area, you don't have the money to do all of the things all of the time. And so you have to be strategic about what is the information you need. And any scientist, as soon as you do one study, it gives you 8 or 10 leads for future studies. And so you have to figure out how you want to allocate your effort. So, in addition to being a really good prep for the midterm, I hope that it gave them an opportunity to use gameplay as a way to think a little bit higher order about how these concepts are related.
And that's, I wouldn't only call it as gameplay. That sounds like some story elements involved as well.
Yeah, I was really fortunate a couple of years ago to take a workshop from Story Collider. My friend Liz Neely was running it, and that focus on telling stories has been so key as a professor, as a dungeon master, as a dad, as a science communicator. Not getting dragged down in the data, but trying to figure out who are the characters. Who are the characters in your test? Who are the characters in your module? Who are the characters in your grant application? Thinking about characters, conflict, and resolution has been a really sort of revolutionary way to change how I've approached anytime I have to talk about science across the board.
Yeah, for sure. And I always like the saying, I forget who the author is, but basically like human beings are storytelling species. Like we built around our culture in trying to describe our environment, because science didn't always exist. And how ways of trying to explain what's going on around us didn't always exist. But story was one of the way to pass down knowledge about our environment. And it's kind of built into us. So going a bit back into the academics, what is your focus of study in marine science?
So I work on a couple of different lines of inquiry. I guess I do historical ecology. So I'm really interested in using kind of non-traditional data sources to understand what ecosystems looked like before we actually started doing scientific investigations on them. And so that's taken a wide range of things. I've used anthropological holdings of shark-toothed weapons to reconstruct past predator ecosystems. We've used logs of whaling ships to look at terrestrial exploitation. These ships would get frozen in the ice and then in the Arctic, and then they would go out and hunt walruses and Arctic fox and caribou. And through these, we discovered that there was a significant terrestrial impact to whaling. And right now, with my students here in New York, we're looking at about 100-year-old record of freshwater fishes in the stream systems around Syracuse to look at how land use change has impacted both species and functional diversity. And at the same time, I've had a long and fortunate career working in Fiji, where I've looked at sort of community-based fisheries, and I've looked at that from a genetic perspective, looking at connectivity among marine reserves. I've especially been interested in looking at at it from a feminist perspective, looking at how men and women view ecosystem services and how conservation plans that are structured largely around men may or may not benefit the species that matter to women. And so that's been a really good mixture of kind of straight fisheries biology, natural history collections, where we go and we collect species and we put them in museums so that we've got a recording in space and time of what biodiversity looks like. And, again, doing participant observation and interviews and trying to, radically ask the people who live there what species matter to them, and use that as a way to structure conservation.
What are some of your most eye-opening findings from that work?
The biggest thing for me early on was Fiji's a very traditional Fijian culture is fairly gender structured, so that I, as a man going through a village, it would be taboo for me to go talk to a woman who I'm not related to, which is, all of them. And it would be similar, like in the US, if I was to go to the mall and go up to a random woman and ask her, so how much do you weigh? I mean, like, I could ask that question, but one doesn't do that, right? Like that's taboo in our society. And what the problem is that because there's such gender inequity in fisheries across the world, it's not just a Fiji problem. There's basically so many dudes in fisheries that when those men go to the village, if it's a gender structured society, they only have access to male knowledge. And that means that they're only interviewing men. They're only going out with men. This is a simplification. It's not that nobody talks to women, but predominantly men's fishing has driven the fisheries reports. And, not only does that sort of erase the labor that women are putting into it, but, at the end of the day, a fish killed by a woman is no less dead than a fish killed by a man. And so if you really want to understand the suite of threats to endangered species, but also the range of conservation options that you have, I think making sure that you incorporate those diverse voices in your programs is critically important. And so I think that's been one of the biggest personal discoveries I've had, is that, going into an area and sort of recognizing the biases that I cause and I bring with me, and then trying to structure my team in such a way as to mitigate those biases, or at least to complement them with other data sources, has been really important. And so, that's manifested itself by, having many women graduate students come with me and training them to work and complement with myself and the male grad students. It's worked by trying to partner up with women Fijian fisheries scientists, working with local conservation organizations, and trying to really, I guess, the biggest thing is taking a step back in this research, so that I have the idea of what I want to figure out, but recognizing that I don't always have to be the person to do it, and that listening to my Fijian colleagues come up with better ways to analyze the data, better ways to ask questions, better ways to address the research. And I guess having the humility to recognize that, this is their country. These are their questions that they need to know. Those are people that I would like to support and partner with, as opposed to coming in maybe when I was younger, or maybe people who are, I guess of a different bent, coming in saying, well, this is my project. I've raised the money. This is how it's going to go. And adopting a really sort of neo-colonial aspect towards research. So I don't know if that's I can't say there's like one sort of shocking scientific finding I've had. I think the biggest thing for me is the personal journey of going through and recognizing that I do much better science when I explicitly carve out voices for Fijian scientists, both men and women, and people who normally don't have as much access to science as I do as a white guy from New York. That's been the biggest thing for me.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, probably all that is trying to remove like ego, your ego from the work. And it's kind of been a big problem, especially like here in South Africa and many African countries, where Western scientists just come in, do the work, mess up the area, don't talk to any of the locals. We call it parachuting science, and it's one of my
Yes, indeed.
my friends at Argonaut Science. They're like a citizen science company. They like to incorporate the local citizens and just populations, because they usually know more about the land than anybody who never lived there, and have, this cultural generational knowledge that could be useful, but as in the past, I think, been overlooked. So I think it's admirable that you're hyper aware of having, local people involved in the science. Pretty cool.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, man.
So, yeah, that's probably one of the ways I think your field of study has changed over the years. Can you think of any other ways that what you do has changed in recent times?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is you've nailed it. I started doing conservation in 2000 when I was just graduated with my master's. So I guess this is my 20th year. And you look back at the major models of conservation back then, it was, this idea of fortress conservation, that you build a park, you put a fence around it, and you kick the people out, and there your problems are solved. And it really wasn't until the mid 2000s or even the 2010 or so that we started seeing this shift. I guess maybe a little bit earlier, but in the 2000s, the integrated development conservation programs, where people started thinking about poverty alleviation as being a viable way to do conservation. And this again goes back to those first things we were talking about in the interview, that when I was learning science as an undergrad, that was a very different thing than learning about development or economics. And as I've seen the program and I've seen conservation biology as a group grow, there really has been a bigger movement towards recognizing that. And I think an extension of that has been this idea of decolonizing science and looking at the way that conservation biology has historically erased indigenous voices and indigenous labor. And that's something that I'm working on now with a couple of students here at ESF, looking at ways that historical ecology as a discipline has systematically erased Native American voices and Native American labor from our understanding of what a natural baseline system is. And so we've got a pretty cool manuscript on that that is 1 or 2 paragraphs away from being submitted. So hopefully that will be done sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. I need a link to that when it's up and running. Speaking of new studies, you are trying to conduct a study around Dugongs and Sea Dragons.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a study that we have up and running. And so if anybody listening has ever listened to a Dugongs and Sea Dragons episode, we want you, and we want your data. So I'm working with a couple of colleagues here at ESF, and essentially what we want to do is we as a group have kind of operated under this assumption that if we tell stories about marine conservation, that's going to be a good way to convey that information. But that's an unfounded or a undemonstrated hypothesis, right? So we actually want to collect data to test that hypothesis. And so we have a pretty short survey. It's like 2 minutes. Basically, it's, how long have you been listening and what do you remember? And when we ask people kind of what they remember or if their opinions on marine conservation have changed, what we're trying to do is see if listening to Dugongs and Sea Dragons has an effect on the audience. We're some of the preliminary. I guess I shouldn't talk about the preliminary data because I don't want to bias the outcome of anybody who might be taking it. But we've got some pretty interesting preliminary data. I think I would be excited to be able to go forward with this because I think we often have this narrative in science communication that, and I think is right, that storytelling is an important way to get information across. But we haven't really tested it in an empirical fashion through the lens of gameplay. There have been in sort of other areas, and as we've seen this resurgence of role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot, I think there's a real opportunity for science communicators to use this as another avenue to go out and reach people. And folks who play role-playing games are generally, I would say, pretty science curious. They tend, I would guess, they tended to have an overall positive view of science. And so these are folks who are probably pretty willing to engage with science communicators. And so I want to do this experiment because I suspect that other podcasts that focus on gameplay or other game systems that incorporate biological knowledge. You think about like Wingspan is a really great board game that uses bird knowledge or photosynthesis, or even Pandemic, although that's a little too real these days.
Yeah.
These are all sort of great board games that are science-based. And I think there's an opportunity for us as science communicators to explore this nexus of gameplay as a way to get our stories out to groups that may not be accessing the information through sort of more traditional means.
For sure. I adore the Pandemic board game, but it is, not the best thing to bring up these days. And there's a lot of more science-based board games that are around now. Games like Evolution, Photosynthesis, Wingspan, like there's so much to choose from. Board games has been flourishing in recent times, which is pretty cool. So talking about research in general globally, like in your opinion, like what do you think we are critically understudying currently that we might pay for later down the line?
Should I say epizootic diseases? That's a pretty obvious one here, although that cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I mean, you think about, you read some of the stuff that Ed Yong has put out about the COVID-19 globally has exposed our weaknesses towards a response towards a global epidemic. But it also shows that that lack of infrastructure is not simply around COVID, that other epidemics could easily fill in. And unless we as a global community reallocate and build up that public health infrastructure, this could happen again in 3 years with something chronic wasting disease coming over from a cervid or something like that. So although that's not my type of science, that's something that is painfully apparent at this point in time. Climate change is another one. I feel like, we hear a lot about it, but it's sometimes such a big problem that people don't know exactly how to address it. And there are many different facets of climate change that come into play. In the US, we see simultaneously getting hit by hurricanes and wildfires, and everything in between. One of the things I'm really curious about from a marine perspective is the policy implications of climate change. So we know that countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu are very, very threatened by climate change. Tuvalu has, I don't know the exact number, but its average height above sea level is under 6 feet, I would say, under 2 meters. It's a very low-lying country. It's very likely that if we do nothing, Tuvalu will no longer be above the water. And so to me, one of the things that scientists and policymakers and political scientists need to think about is what happens to fisheries management in countries that are no longer above water. So if Tuvalu sinks, it has a huge EEZ, and that EEZ contains many, many valuable tuna stocks. Who runs that? Do they create a government in absentia because they move to Fiji or they move to Australia? And does everybody who used to be a Tuvaluan get a vote for management? Does it just become open ocean? Can it barter access to an EEZ in order to have more kind migration policies for places like with New Zealand. We just don't know about that. But if you think about big conservation issues, big biodiversity issues in marine settings, maintaining the health of the coral reefs there and of the open ocean fisheries, we just don't know what's going on with that. And I've tried to ask folks, and everybody recognizes that that's a problem, but I've not seen people come up with a solid leadership approach towards that. And that's a problem that's going to happen. It's not going to happen in the next 3 or 5 years. It's not going to happen in the next election cycle. But it's something we're going to need to think about. This broader issue of climate migration and climate diaspora is going to have a huge impact on biodiversity, both on the areas that are getting dry and or warm, and on those areas that are absorbing tens of millions of people. And that's something that we need to be proactive about, because we can see that truck speeding down the highway without brakes on, and we have to act before it hits us.
Yeah, it's kind of it's so obvious to us who well like for most of my like master's PhD work is all like global change related in some way. And if you spend any time like just looking through the literature and just reading up, like it's so obvious that it's going to be a problem one day, but it's also frustrating that so little is going on. I have a friend who worked at the UN, and he was just totally like, he ended up being so despondent about, what's being done about climate change. Because even there, it's difficult to get anything done. The politics kind of puts roadblocks in your way, and it's tough. It's tough because like we know there's going to be a problem, but we don't know how we're going to get anybody, I suppose, mobilized in some way.
Yeah, I mean, David Quammen, the guy who wrote Spillover and Song of the Dodo and many other amazing books, had this really good point when he was talking about COVID. He's like, we knew this was going to be a problem, but it's a problem that had a low probability of occurring in the next election cycle. And so when we know that these problems are occurring, but they're occurring further out than an election cycle, we're asking politicians to come up with big bills to address things that are going to happen when they're out of office. So they incur all of the costs, but people 5 or 6 election cycles down the road are going to be the ones who reap the benefits. And, not to be overly cynical about politics, because Lord knows we don't need any more of that in this year. That's a tough ask to kick that can down the curb.
For sure. It's just a tiring thing to think about sometimes. But speaking of having infinite resources, maybe if you had an infinite amount of time and funding, like what kind of study would you try and conduct? Like what are you most interested with if you had all the money and all the time, all the resources?
I mean, so many fun things to choose from. I am a huge believer in the value of place-based learning. And so if I had infinite time and infinite money, I would want to bolster up a series of marine labs around the world. And those marine labs would be done in consultation with local people and ways and explicit mechanisms to make sure that they have an on-road into participating into it. But I have been blessed to go to some amazing marine labs. I think of Friday Harbor, or I did my PhD out of Woods Hole, or even places that are a little bit warmer, like Glover's Reef in Belize, that's run by WCS. And the sheer amount of epiphanies that occur when you are out on the dock watching the sunset, having a cool beverage, and the frigate birds are flying over the sky. That is where magic happens. And so if I could facilitate a series of those occurring throughout the globe, each well-staffed with the requisite infrastructure to be able to support rigorous empirical research occurring out of there, if we could get 20 or 40 of those linked together, the amount of amazing science that could be produced with that sort of infrastructure would be far beyond anything I could do with a single project sort of run out of my lab. But the amount of magic that you could create in that, and the amount of lives that you could touch through that would be just stellar.
For sure. It's all dreams we have as poor scientists trying to beg for funding all the time. But same question, but for your geeky endeavors and hobbies, what would you do with that money and resources?
I would love, I'm all right. So that was a global approach. I'm going to go local here. I would love to set up a game shop in an area that's been traditionally underserved. And I would love to do that sort of like an 826 LA kind of idea where we partner with local city schools and we come up with a place that is safe for students to go after school where they can get tutoring, but then where they can also have a game club. They can get the core books for free and then they can buy the additional ones. But a place where students can go after school that is safe, is pro-learning and pro-creativity, and they can check the stresses that they have to deal with in everyday life for 2 hours they can check those at the door, and they can spend 2 hours where they have agency, where they can be the heroes, where the good guys always win. And they're done in an area that is supported, where they're warm, where they can get food, where they can get help with school, and where they can be creative kids. And I would love to have a shop like that set up here in Syracuse. I would love to have a series of shops like that set up in metropolitan areas throughout the country. I think that would be, again, it would touch a lot of lives, and it would provide an opportunity for a lot of voices that are, for a series of reasons, kept out of gaming right now. Give them a hand and give them a space with the mic.
For sure. I think both your answers goes to show that there's definitely like infrastructure problems in the modern world for some areas, and it's one of those. I think it's one of those things where we have a tendency, especially governments, to look at things like from the top down instead of like the bottom up, and it kind of it hurts in some areas where it's like, okay, maybe if you start at grassroots level and build something up, you might have ended up with a better scenario than trying to like shove money from the top down.
Yeah, I mean, and in the U.S. we've had this. I mean, I'm going to go contentious here because why not? In the U.S., we've had this conversation about defunding police and what that might be. And that's obviously not saying that there should be no police, but things like the Police Athletic League have a really strong track record of ultimately being cost effective by reducing crime in areas. And that works for a certain group of kids. I would like to see this as an opportunity, either run with the police, or if we divert some funds away from the police, as an alternative way of dealing with crime and dealing with, educational issues that we face. And I'm not coming across as anti-police per se, but I'm just saying that if we are creative about ways that we address the root causes of crime, we don't always have to respond with one tool. Kind of like, again, to wrap it up, playing D&D as a little kid, the only thing I did was to hit things with my short sword, because that's the only thing that I could do. And the game became better when we learned at other ways to solve problems. And I think that lesson works with the approach of that we're seeing here in the U.S. and the problems that we're seeing with systemic racism in our cities. And if we find other tools and we think about, if we're creative about other ways to approach problems, we might come up with solutions that are more innovative and ways that can touch kids who otherwise, only see the police as an oppressive force.
For sure. And I mean, creativity and thinking out of the box works both in D&D and in reality. For science, especially for, I suppose, rigid structures that are kind of stuck in place, that we kind of know are not working, but I suppose it's just there and it's difficult. Given the flow of the show and like what we talked about, there's kind of a topic that I want to touch on. That's kind of like tinfoil hatty. So, like, would you want to get in there?
Sure, why not?
So, I've been watching. Like, I also talked about this last week with General Steve, who's a historian and archaeologist. So I know you mentioned you did a bit of like historical ecology, which this kind of touches on, but the current conventional knowledge about wiping out of the large mammals in North America was that human beings went over there and hunted all of them out. But I think there's now evidence that's coming in slowly to say that it might have been a cataclysm, some kind of asteroid that did that instead. And that could have also potentially taken out advanced, not meaning like super civilization, but like some kind of advanced that we thought at the time would have been different civilization, as well as all the large terrestrial mammals. So what do you think about that? Like, have you thought about this in any way? Do you know about the new theories? What do you think based on what you know?
I admit, I don't know much about that. I do know Tim Flannery's idea, his great book, The Eternal Frontier, kind of talks about a melded blitzkrieg hypothesis where a combination of overhunting and climate change combined led to defaunaling of, if that's a word, of the Americas. But I, to be honest, I haven't followed that literature in a while, and so I don't know the data around what you're talking about. But it certainly is intriguing, and we have seen large global impacts of cataclysms. You think about Krakatoa exploding, leading to a reduction of 1.8 degrees in Celsius in the average temperature of the globe for 2 to 3 years. You see other mega volcanoes exploding, leading to things like the year without summer. Somebody actually once said that there was a volcano in the 30s that exploded that led to the invention or the propagation of the bicycle, because there was so much ash put up that the wheat crops didn't grow, and so horses became too expensive to feed. So people started using bicycles as a mode of transportation. So there certainly is a historical precedent for massive shifts, both ecological and cultural, occurring due to cataclysms. And if you look at kind of Jared Diamond's work, I'm not the biggest Jared Diamond fan out there, but his book Collapse talks about what happens when civilizations develop a culture predicated on one particular suite of climate variables, that when those climate variables rapidly change, you can see that there is, as the title implies, a rapid collapse. So you look at the places like Chaco Canyon, you see the ancestors of the people who used to live there, the Native American tribes who used to live there. They went out. They became extinct relatively rapidly because they founded that area during a abnormally wet period. And when climate equilibrated and that area went back to the norm and it became dry, their culture was predicated around maize production, and it became too dry for that. And so they just disappeared. And that's why you get things like the Anasazi canyons and this area that disappeared. And so, I don't know the data that you're talking about, but you could imagine situations that might have led to what it is you're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. I barely even read up on it as well. This is secondhand information based on podcasts and stuff. But I just think it's
you can't trust everything you hear on the internet.
No. That's why I ask people's opinions.
But you can't trust this podcast, though.
For sure. Well, I suppose you can for now, before I get before the comments start coming in. But I think with that, I think it's time to pack up camp and head back to our labs and/or fantasy worlds. But first, why don't you let our fellow explorers know where they can find you and your work on the internet?
You can check out Dugongs and Sea Dragons at the aptly named website, dugongsandseadragons.weebly.com. And on there, you can get the link to the ongoing scientific research that we're doing. We would love to have you participate. And you can check out my research at Labroides, labroides.org. Although maybe this will now get me to update my website because it is painfully out of date.
Well, yeah, definitely go check the work that's going on by Prof Drew and the guys over at Dugongs and Sea Dragons. And thank you, Prof Drew, for joining us, and thank you to the listener for sparing your time. Hope you guys had fun learning with us today. Otherwise, stay safe, keep well, stay tuned. Cheers.
All right, thanks.